Hi. So one of my YouTube followers asked me an interesting question about my opinion on publishing as a PhD student. So I'm going to give you a few things to think about in this video on whether or not you should focus on publishing while you are still pursuing your doctoral studies. The first thing that you need to remember is that do what your advisor says. At all costs, do what your advisor says. And this is important. You got to remember, as a PhD student, you are neither student nor employee exactly. You're kind of in that nebulous realm between the two domains. You know, because you're not a student, you're not really entitled to anything, and because you're not an employee exactly, you don't really have any rights. So you're totally at your advisor's mercy, right? If your advisor is pushing you to publish, then you publish. If your advisor is telling you don't publish, then don't publish. You've got to do whatever it takes to finish that doctorate and get out, okay? Number one, because if you don't, you know, if you're thinking ahead for the job market or something else and it doesn't go with what your advisor wants and you get kicked out of your PhD program or you lose funding or whatever, you're in so much trouble because you've basically spent 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or longer years with no degree, unless you've gotten a MPhil because of your comprehensive or qualifying exam, which is not every school. So you basically got no degree, you've got no academic job, you've got nothing to show for all that time that you've spent doing research, just a blank gap in your resume. So do what your advisor says. That is so important, okay? And make sure that you meet with your advisor regularly to make sure that you're making sufficient progress to get done and get out of your PhD program. And I'll kind of give an example of this. So there's this one framework that I used. Some of you may have watched some of my videos on the different ontologies in business, government, society, you know, undifferentiated individual ontology, differentiated relational ontology, etc., etc. So my original thesis, the way I did my proposal defense, not the thesis defense, but the proposal defense, incorporated this framework, comparing these different ontologies in the field of entrepreneurship. Well, you know what? My external committee, or my external examiners, they thrashed it. I mean, they thrashed it. They hated it. They said it was crap. They said it was garbage. Under no circumstances was I to use that as the basis for my thesis. So I had to basically rewrite the whole thing, right? And I had a year to do it. But I did it, okay? And once I got my doctorate, guess what? My second paper that I published, which was in a good journal, used the same framework my externals told me I couldn't use, right? And I've published 2 papers just this past year using that same framework, okay? But the difference is I have my doctorate, I have a job, and I'll publish kind of wherever and whatever I want to do. I'm no longer a PhD student, okay? So this is important. Do what your advisor says. Remember that the best kind of a PhD is a done PhD, okay? So that's my first caveat. The second thing that I want you to think about is figure out what's the format of your thesis, right? There are some schools where you publish a monograph thesis, and so a monograph is usually like a very, very long, almost like a book, right? I know in some French schools, you know, monograph will be 600 to 800 pages, and it traces, you know, the history of your problem from Aristotle all the way to the present day. Some actually make like a book with chapters that are not standalone articles, but it's just like a book, maybe a couple hundred pages, right? That's a monograph thesis. And a monograph thesis is a lot harder to convert into articles than where a lot of business schools are going now, where they do thesis by articles. Okay, let's kind of compare the two. My own thesis was a thesis by articles. I had an introductory article, and actually, ironically, my original introduction that my committee hated, I turned that into a published article. Gosh. Yeah, so the same framework that external examiners, that they hated that I mentioned, yeah, I've published 4 articles out of it. The same framework that they said didn't pass muster. So my original introduction for my thesis that I used in my proposal, that became an article. The updated one actually has not become an article yet. But anyhow, I had an introductory article, and I want to say it was maybe 60 pages. It was a little longer, so I had to trim it down just a little bit before I published it. But, you know, really not a big deal. I just cut out the sections of that article that said, you know, this is what to expect in the thesis. It took me I don't know, all of an hour to prep that for publication. Then I had an article on methodology, explaining the unique methodology that I was using for my thesis. I had 2 empirical articles in my thesis, and then I had a conclusion that was about 15 pages wrapping it together. So the goal was that I would basically have 3 ready-to-go articles and then an intro with just a little bit of work after I defended. So that was my thesis, a thesis by articles, and I want to say it was maybe around 200 pages or so. I mean, but again, it was in a format that was very easy to get published. So a lot of it's going to depend on thesis by monograph or thesis by article. If you're doing a thesis by monograph, yeah, you probably need to pay attention to getting that monograph done. It's a little easier if you've got a thesis by article. So figure out what kind of format of thesis that you're expected to do. The next thing, and we're going to assume that you are doing a thesis by article for some of these suggestions. I think that trying to do articles, as long as your advisor is okay with it, or a lot of people have PhD supervisors that are just totally indifferent to what they're doing. These are advisors that just aren't present for whatever reason. The advisor's busy, the advisor doesn't care. Some advisors also believe in kind of a process of self-discovery, so you kind of stumble on your own, and then they're there to kind of help you when the thesis defense comes. So you've got to figure out, the personality with your advisor. So that's important. But all right, let's say that you have an advisor who either doesn't care or is fine with you trying to publish while you are still a PhD student. Okay, what I would tell you to do is get like one article as high a quality as you possibly can at this stage in your career. Get it as good as you can possibly make it. Get some feedback from some faculty within the school if you can get it. If you can't, or even after you do get that feedback, but either way, once you think that is as good as it can be, after getting feedback from your PhD colleagues, getting feedback from maybe some faculty members, I say go ahead and send it to a journal. Okay? Send it to a journal. Now here's the thing. How do you pick which journals to send it to, right? It depends on what your goal is. And as a PhD student, by the way, I still kind of do this. I always make my first pick of journal a journal that's way out of reach, like an A or an A+, the absolute best in my field journal, right? And here's the reason. If I get desk rejected, a lot of the good journals, not all of them, and this is kind of a trial and error thing, right? A lot of good journals, even if they desk reject you, will give you like at least 2 or 3 pages of really high quality feedback, okay? And you can use that. So when you get feedback, you're getting feedback from the journal editor who's probably one of the best in your field. So go for it. Now if you get lucky and you make it past desk rejection, you may get it sent out for reviews and you'll get 3 really high quality reviewers. And so this can be very developmental, all right? There's a couple journals in my field of entrepreneurship. I know which ones they are. I always send my papers to them first. I figure I probably won't get accepted. Sometimes I'm pleasantly surprised and I actually get a revise and resubmit. And I've got a couple of journals that are going through this revise and resubmit process. But even if I'm rejected, I know that I get really good feedback from those journals, and I'm okay with that. Now, the downside of this, of course, is that you're tying up that paper, right? You basically can't send it anywhere else while you've sent it to that top journal. Yeah, and sometimes those reviews can take a long, long time. I had a paper that I sent to this one journal, and it took them 9 months before I got I did get rejected, but with reviews. But it took 9 months to do that. And so I couldn't do anything with that paper for 9 months. This is really tough as a PhD student because you're not going to have a really strong portfolio of papers yet. So, it's not a perfect solution. But let me tell you why you submit to a top journal versus to a crappy journal. And I've tried this approach too. Just trying to get something out there. Crappy journals are going to have crappy editors with crappy reviewers, and they're going to give you crappy feedback. I mean, if you're lucky, you get the paper in pretty quick with pretty painless review process. Okay, congratulations, you've got a C-level journal on your CV. Great. Worst case scenario though, it takes months for them to give you really bad feedback. I had a paper, and it's one of my favorite papers. It's actually one I wrote as a PhD student, and I love this paper. It's still one of my favorite papers. I made a mistake with the paper though because I used too much philosophy in an entrepreneurship paper. Entrepreneurship journals hate it, philosophy journals hate it. and I send it to some below average philosophy journals, and sometimes I get a 1-sentence desk rejection. This is not the theory of forms, reject, and that's all they'd say. And it took 3 months to get that kind of feedback. That's anticlimactic. So I always say start with the highest quality journal first, and then make your improvements, and then kind of start working your way down. I think this is a good strategy to take. So I would say as a PhD student, send it out and get the feedback. Get the feedback from some of the best people in the field out there. Now, the other thing that you want to think about is if you can get a publication and you're doing a defense by articles, this is really good, especially if one of those publications is in your thesis defense. And the reason is the standards of getting an article published is so much higher than what it takes to pass a thesis defense, right? I even reflect upon my own defense. So as I mentioned, I had 4 articles. Now, one of them was under second round, revised and resubmitted a very good journal. And so when my committee tried to go after me and say, hey, why'd you do this? I don't like this. I said, well, the reviewers from this journal wanted that. And that shut them up right away. And my committee really had no feedback on that particular article because what I was going through for journal publication was so much more rigorous than what anything they could have suggested, right? And thesis defenses can be really, really tough, harrowing experiences. And so if you can count on, 1 article out of 4 not giving you a hard time, hey, that's pretty good. You can focus on the other ones. There was a lady in my program, she was 3 years ahead of me, and she was a really, really, really strong PhD student. Her thesis was 5 articles, and 4 of them had been published, and one of them was like 3rd round revise and resubmit. I mean, we knew it was going to get published. And her committee basically asked her really softball questions like, why did you choose entrepreneurship? And what was the most memorable, part of your PhD experience? I mean, really easy stuff. I mean, the defense was a joke because what could they possibly add at that point, right? Because the rigor of publication is so much higher than it is for passing a PhD defense, okay? So that's another reason to try to publish. Again, focus on a couple of high quality papers, and send those out. I wouldn't try to have a bunch of like really crap papers and then try to send those out. And I hate to sound skeptical, but as a PhD student, your bad papers are going to be really bad. When you kind of start getting better, I was looking at some of the papers I thought were very good as a PhD student. I look back on them, 5-6 years out after I wrote them. I'm like, oh man, I thought that was a good paper. This is terrible, right? So you develop and you grow in your craft. So your bad papers as a PhD student are going to be really, really bad compared to even your bad papers as a full-time professor. So really try to get those papers as good as you can get. I'd say try to get 2, maybe 3 of them if you're lucky out the door, and try to get those into a journal somewhere. So consider it as an aid also for your thesis defense. Now probably the question that you're really getting at, my friend who asked me this, and probably those of you that are watching this video, is what about the job market and publishing? This is probably one of the toughest questions, okay? And, I've been on the job market twice. Well, 2, 3 times, depending on how you count being on the job market. But I've been on that side as an applicant 2 or 3 times. And then, of course, every year as a faculty member, I'm always on the recruitment committee. And so I'm actually looking at applicants, and I can kind of give you the inside scoop on what we're looking at. If someone is just finishing their PhD, it's nice if they have publications. That shows a lot of promise, and that can make you an attractive candidate, especially if you're looking at working at a research-oriented university. So that's a good thing, right? Now, the other thing that you've got to consider is what about your teaching portfolio? And you have to think about the way committees are looking at your application, right? They need somebody who can fill an immediate teaching need. Your research is more to determine whether you get tenure or not, right? So can you teach certain courses or not? I think that focusing on your teaching is not as important as the research, because the research is what's going to get your thesis defended, but it's not something to blow off. The head of my PhD program, when I went through, kept telling us how teaching wasn't important and all this other kind of crap. I never believed that. Also because, I've always held myself to a higher standard. You should always be the best that you can possibly be. And so that, to me, that translated into excellence in teaching. And so when I was on the job market, I handed in excellent teaching evaluations. In fact, some of my students said that I was better than the full-time faculty that were teaching. And when I handed that in on the job market, that's what got me the first job. I'm an entrepreneurship researcher for the most part, but I was hired to teach business ethics because the guy that was teaching business ethics before was retiring and there was an urgent need. They didn't care about my research at all. They just wanted to know, could I fill in this temporary teaching gap? And that's what got me the job. I was rejected by universities way better than where I took my first job, and I was rejected by universities like just total garbage universities compared to where I got my first job. But it was a matter of, did I fit a teaching profile of that department? Because schools have immediate short-term needs. The research thing is to figure out whether you have a chance of getting tenure or not. And most people aren't going to look at you whether, is this person going to get tenure in 6 years? I mean, I don't know that anybody really thinks about it because I don't think we know, right? You get here, maybe you have good luck and you get your publications, you get tenure, maybe you don't, or maybe you give out. I mean, there's so many things that can happen in 6 years. I don't think too many people actually try to predict that with any sort of accuracy. So they're looking at, do you have a chance at tenure, not are you going to get tenure? And most importantly, what does your teaching portfolio look like? I think that's way more important. And of course, the other thing that you need to think about is, are you going to apply for a position at a teaching or a research school? Now, if you're trying to go to like an R1, top U.S. research university, or an FT 100 business school, then yeah, I mean, the publication thing is almost mandatory. You pretty much have to have at least one publication. But you're probably, if you're going to get a job at a school like that, you're probably at another FT 100 business school, and you have kind of the hookups that get you those publications before you graduate. I mean, there's a lot of schools do this, where as a first-year PhD student, you get some kind of like a research apprenticeship where you help write a paper with a senior faculty member. You're like the third or fourth author on it, and then you get basically a publication at the end of the first year. Now, it's ridiculous to assume that a first-year PhD student is going to publish or be a legitimate co-author on an A-level publication. The senior faculty members for that have been gathering data and working on revises and resubmits on this paper for years, right? 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6 years for an A-level publication, in terms of the research and everything else. So it's absurd to assume that a first-year PhD student really contributed anything on there, but that's part of the game. And yes, if you go to a school that does not have this kind of research apprenticeship where you're starting to publish, as a PhD student, it does put you at a disadvantage if you are looking to go to a top-tier research university. It absolutely does. But if you're looking to go to a teaching university, that doesn't really matter. They're going to be more interested in the fact, can you teach and do a great job teaching, and can you also do a certain minimum level of publications? And of course, that's not to say that, when you get out of graduate school, that you start mastering your craft of research and you start getting better. I went to a university that did, it technically had a research apprenticeship for first-year students, but nobody published out of it. It wasn't done as well as it is at other schools. And so, no, I did not have a publication when I got out of graduate school, although I did have a second or third round revised and resubmitted at a very good journal, right? But that was something that I had started, and I had some good feedback from my advisor to kind of help me along. But then again, I've always been on the, kind of ambidextrous universities. I'm expected to be good at teaching and expected to be good at research. I'm not at a research-centric university. So these are just some thoughts. Took some notes here to prep for this. I'm seeing if I missed anything. So these are some ideas on whether you need to be publishing as a PhD student or not. To all of my YouTube followers, but especially the one that asked the question, I hope this answers your question. I hope this gives you some insight into the process. I'll post some other things on academic job markets and some other things. Hopefully this will be helpful. But if there's anything else like you have a specific question on, just post them in the comments, and I will I'll make up another video. Now that I'm back from Christmas break, I had a little bit of a hiatus in my posting. But if you just put the questions down there in the comment section, I will I'll make another video or anything if there's any sort of ambiguity. So if you like this video, or you have a if you like the video, give me a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe. I think it's on that side. Also, if there's any other videos that interest you, put them in the comments and I'll make something up for you. So again, thanks for watching, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time.